did they fire you?
Don't we wish we knew?
Okay.
They would have had to have stated a reason. They would have had to tell the other board members why. There was no discussion, no debate, nothing.
Is that a proper procedure for firing somebody?
No, of course not. It was a violation of every aspect of my contract, and they did it against the advice of every lawyer they talked to. So, of course, they did these things with no lawyer on the call.
And I understand also there are no minutes. There haven't been any minutes of the.
Finally, they produced one set of minutes specific to that meeting only. None of the rest of the minutes since the board have turned over have been approved.
So it seems like at Pacifica that this is an ongoing crisis. I mean, of one interim executive director after another. Now, one of the issues that has been raised is they're saying that you were a temporary employee. You were a temporary executive director of Pacifica. Is that true, or what is the actual
That would be news
facts?
to me also. No, I was interim for almost a year and a half, and then they hired me permanently, and then I signed a contract, and the new board turned over with their slender two-person majority and decided they were just going to vote that they didn't recognize my contract. That's what they did. They just voted at the February in-person meeting that they weren't going to recognize my contract. They would just find it to be invalid and then start taking away my authority as the executive director. And then they started calling me the interim executive director on agendas shortly before they moved in to illegally fire me.
And were the board members advised about your discharge, the action they were going to take before it
No,
happened?
not at all. There was no discussion. The board majority obviously colluded with each other because they came in knowing what they were voting on, and the board minority didn't even know it was going to be happening, and two board members weren't even on the call because this wasn't on the agenda, and one left in protest when it was put forward. So, I mean, it was completely in violation of everything resembling notice requirements.
And what time did this action take place?
It was like 8:48 p.m. Pacific, 11:48 p.m. Eastern when this went down, and there was a midnight Eastern adjournment time, so Jose Luis Fuentes rushed to put forward a motion to terminate before the clock ran out that night, and they did it with no discussion and no debate, and then falsely reported out in the report out that the P&B met in closed session to discuss personnel matters, except you would have to discuss something then.
Now, what do you think is behind this action by Margy Wilkinson and these people?
Well, at the immediate front end of it, the books are the most obvious thing because KPFA hasn't reconciled its books in 18 months since October of 2012 and has steadfastly refused to turn them over or to reconcile them, and their final deadline was that day, March 13th, and my staff was told by the staff next door that, quote, they didn't have to listen to Summer Reese and weren't turning over the books. So clearly, some folks at KPFA knew that this was going to happen hours in advance of the vote being taken and long before the rest of the board knew.
So when you say people refuse to turn over the books, what people?
You have a business department over there. Your business office would be responsible.
And who is that?
I'd rather not say individual names, but every station has a business office and a business manager, and they're responsible for the books. So the business
manager at KPFA refused to turn over the records to the Pacifica Foundation.
Right, which caused us to have to reschedule our audit last week from field work start date of April to June, which now means that we'll be lucky to complete an audit by the August 15th extended tax deadline, and we won't see any CPB funds this year at all as a result of this because we won't have our audit done in time.
And have other stations refused to turn over their books?
No, everyone's turned over their books except for KPFA.
And why do you think that they're refusing to turn over the books?
One can only conjecture on that, but it's a nonprofit organization, and it's not legally acceptable to not reconcile your books for a year and a half and to make it impossible to hold a certified audit, which is required by law. So, I mean, the actions of this one unit has now jeopardized over $1 million in funding for the entire network.
And have there been other issues of financial irregularities at KPFA or Pacifica in general?
Well, Pacifica in general has been cited year after year for a lack of internal controls, which is an accounting term meaning having appropriate controls internally to make sure that your money is accounted for and can't be stolen. In the fiscal year 2012, our last audited year, our annual budgets are around $13 million for the whole network. $7 million of our income ended up in suspense accounts, which the auditors say suspense accounts are accounts for which there is no explanation or you lack sufficient documentation to tell what it is. So more than half of our money was categorized in our audit as something we couldn't explain or didn't have documentation as to what we did with it. That's a problem.
And this financial crisis that KPFA and Pacifica is in, how deep is it, and does it threaten the network, and does it threaten the existence of KPFA?
Sure, the whole network is in jeopardy. I mean, I think anyone who's been following very closely, which is only some people, but Pacifica is millions of dollars in debt and was when I took the helm in 2012. So we're in extremely critical financial condition. Our New York signal, as has played out in the press, has been had a lot of bids and offers on it because New York has been in a lot of trouble. And we had to lay off 2/3 of the staff there last year. And the day that the vote to terminate me was made was the same day that we honored our severance obligations to our union employees in New York City, which was, a big deal for the network to actually be able to complete that obligation to our staff. So, yeah, we are in a very precarious position financially, and any issues with our books are of concern, I think, to the whole network, and we have multiple issues. So.
And what was the response of the people that have taken the action against you to this financial crisis?
I think they seem completely disconnected from what's actually going on with the network in any real and meaningful fashion. I mean, we have 2 stations that are operating at low power because their equipment is in such poor condition that they can't actually go up to full power. One of them is in license renewal, and it can't go to full power long enough to renew its license right now. The board isn't discussing these issues at all. When we were in Washington, D.C., discussion with our FCC counsel on what to do with New York was cut off arbitrarily to rehire the terminated CFO. So the interest in actually addressing the real financial problems, I think, is almost non-existent by this board.
And the rehiring the terminated CFO, what was his situation?
We had a CFO who was probationary, and there were several workplace complaints. He was placed on leave. A system-wide performance evaluation was conducted. He was terminated by the old board, and the new board made as one of its first actions rehiring him. He remained on leave pending the outcome of the workplace investigation, which Margy Wilkinson took possession of 2 weeks ago and has refused to share with the rest of the board, but has gotten a motion passed to put him back on our bank accounts as a signatory and has been instructing staff to put him into our system. But they haven't taken a vote to actually reinstate him because they haven't looked at the workplace investigation because Margy hasn't shared it with the rest of the board. So it's pretty scandalous what's going on.
Now, some people have said that what you should do is not take the action that you've taken, coming to the office and saying you're going to continue to operate, but you should sue Pacifica. You have a different point of view, and why have you taken the action you've taken?
Because I love Pacifica, and Pacifica can't afford to have me sue it for my breached contract, because that's hundreds of thousands of dollars on top of the millions of dollars of debt Pacifica already has. And the same day they took this action, I forwarded a letter from our insurance carrier saying, don't take any more employment action without human resources personnel because of your high loss ratio. You can't afford any more employment litigation, or you risk becoming uninsurable. And that's what this board has done. Their action against me has made the organization perhaps uninsurable. And if I were to sue, you could guarantee that. So,
and what does that mean when you're uninsurable?
It means that when you get sued, you don't have insurance, and no matter how much it costs, you have to pay for it yourself. And last year, we were turned down by 30 insurance carriers because of the amount of employment litigation this organization had prior to my taking the helm. We've had no employment litigation in the 20 months that I've been the interim or executive director, and that's because I listen to our attorneys and do what you are supposed to do in employment situations, and we haven't been sued. But prior to that, we'd had a great deal of litigation, and there was a point at which insurance carriers decide you're not running your business well enough to bother giving you insurance anymore because you're not a good risk, and we are not a good risk.
Now, one of the issues apparently in Pacifica is what is going to be happening with WBAI, which owes money, is in a deep financial crisis, and there's a section in the Pacifica board that have supported your removal on the basis that they're going to defend WBAI, or they say that the WBAI is threatened and they want to protect WBAI.
Well, I think if you ask just about anybody from WBAI, they'll say that I've been the one person that's been defending WBAI since I got here and has kept them on the air, like by sheer force of will that they have stayed broadcasting. The same people who put forward the motion to fire me, one of them immediately put a motion to swap the signal back on the agenda. So,
and what does that mean, swapping the signal?
We had swap offers last year. It's where you take a high quality signal like we have in WBAI and you trade it for a lower quality, different type of signal, literally a lower quality signal that has a far diminished reach, and you take some money and a lesser quality signal and you give your high quality signal to someone else in exchange for a few $1 million.
Now, you are talking to the FCC, or have you contacted the FCC? Or
CPB is who I'm talking to.
CPB, and why did you contact them?
Well, because the actions of the station next door have caused a situation in which we will not get our CPB money this year. We are already under a high level of scrutiny from CPB, and I felt it was necessary to talk to them about what was going on here, and particularly what appears to be going on financially, because someone has to get to the bottom of what's going on in our books, and we don't have the resources or the wherewithal to conduct forensic audits and see what's happening.
So you're saying that this is, for you, an issue of transparency,
Completely.
financial transparency of what is happening in Pacifica, and you've been trying to get to the bottom of that situation?
To quote CPB, if you are going to save the institution, you need to clean it up.
And have you faced roadblocks in doing that, in addition to...
Oh, it's been nonstop resistance, but that's at every level of compliance and internal controls. I mean, when I came in here as an organization with a lot of compliance issues, and every single aspect of just making things compliant with normal business practices
Such
encounters
as?
a roadblock.
Like what, for example?
We got resistance. Well, this is from this station again last week on vendor controls, so that you can't add your brother-in-law and write him a check. You know, you have one department adds the vendor and another department writes the check. These are things you shouldn't resist. But in Los Angeles, it took over a year to get a lockbox put in place. And a lockbox is a third-party control at your bank, where you receive the money at the bank instead of at the station. Again, no reason to resist it as long as you're not doing anything wrong. It's a normal practice. I sent out a memo a couple of months ago, I think January 30th, to all 5 of the stations asking for an accounting of the last 3 fund drives premiums. Just tell me what was ordered, what orders have you placed with vendors, have you paid for them, and have you shipped them to the listeners. Very simple. What was ordered, what's been shipped, it's 2 months later. I haven't gotten an accounting from anyone. Everyone acted like this was an impossible thing to do. There was absolutely no way we could tell you how much money was raised, how many premiums were ordered, and whether or not we've actually placed the orders or whether we've shipped them to the public. And I only asked for 3 drives. That's 1 year, less than 1 year's worth of activity. I didn't ask for 3 years worth of drives. I just said the most recent drives. Could you tell me if we've shipped the premiums or not? And no one, and I do mean no one, has responded to that.
Well, don't you have paid staff in charge of premiums and
Yes.
getting this information and being responsible to put this into computers and taking care of this accountability?
One of the findings of our auditors is that throughout the system we don't reconcile our MEMSIS system to our general ledger. What that means, MEMSIS is our membership database, and it has the information incoming as to how much money is being pledged and at what premiums are being shipped. The general ledger is the money in the bank account and actual cash. If you don't reconcile the 2 systems to each other, you have no idea what was ordered versus what you collected money on. And that's one of the things the auditors noted, is that we don't reconcile our systems to each other, so we really can't tell what's going on. So this is across the network that there is a resistance to, again, standard accounting practices.
And do you think that this is intentional or just incompetence, or what is the cause of this?
One tends to think incompetence at first, and then if the resistance is too strong, then one tends to think intentional. In this particular situation, the resistance has been incredibly strong to something as simple as turning over books. I mean, we said if you can't reconcile the books, turn them over and someone else will reconcile the books, but at the end of the day, we still have to have this information.
So you said you could turn the books over to someone else.
We have a CPA who works here. I mean, it's like someone can reconcile the books. Whether you can do it yourself or someone else has to do it, at the end of the day, it has to be done. And in terms of things like the premiums, yes, that resistance has been throughout the network in terms of that accountability. It's all been about accountability. I mean, I brought in the person who consults on our accounting software to set up internal controls here so we could audit from the national office what was going on at the stations and actually be able to tell after a fund drive, did you order your premiums? Because when you get complaints from people saying you might have Federal Trade Commission violations, I'm required by law to deal with this stuff. People make a complaint to me, then it's my job to figure out, are we compliant here? And if we're not, fix the system. And that's what I've been doing progressively. And everyone knows that, and there's a paper trail on that. But in the last few weeks leading up to the vote to terminate, all of that had increased in terms of our demands because we were late, because the audit was past due. I mean, it was a really practical matters. We needed the books in order to get on with the audit preparation, which was the only thing we were thinking of from this office. But the timing was, very interesting.
And you think it's connected to your request or your demand that this financial information be provided?
I think they're all connected. I mean, we have potential copyright issues. This station does its own duplication in-house, as our East Coast station was doing, and I had complaints about that. The same day as the termination vote, I also got a memo back from our FCC counsel on copyright, because I was cracking down on people on that, making sure you know that you cannot copy copyrighted material. And this is the only station that has resisted vociferously allowing its duplication to be done at the archives unit in Los Angeles. And again, I was given perfectly plausible reasons for that, in terms of, we're producing things that we have the copyright to, our speeches that people do here, and all that may be the case, but there are quite a few possibilities there for lack of compliance, to put it mildly.
Why would KPFA, for example, do things that are improper as far as copying and other things like that, if it puts the station in jeopardy and the foundation in jeopardy?
Well, when you have every single year's audit says we lack internal controls and cites us for problems in our accounting system. So when you say KPFA, I mean, systemically, in an organization which doesn't have internal controls, you may have any number of people who are doing things that you are not aware of for their own benefit or for some collective benefit that doesn't benefit the organization. So depending on how extensive this is, any station may be doing something that they're not being accountable to the network or to the public.
Now, KPFA and Pacifica is the largest national alternative network, broadcast network in the United States. What do you see as, and obviously there are people who would like to shut it down,
Yes.
To prevent it from broadcasting the material that it does present. What do you see as a way of rebuilding it? The listener audience has been dropping. The age of many of the listeners of Pacifica and KPFA is aging. What is the solution beyond just this whole financial crisis and continuing problem with the debt?
Well, I think the first thing is you have to have, a clean house and transparency. So you do need to have it running properly and being accountable to the public. And then I believe if we weren't caught in this constant state of warfare in Pacifica and the board focused on, various internal issues, then the organization could focus more effectively on things like programming, outreach, all the things to address having new audience that we don't. There's also the issue of what's called churn factor, that we have a high rate of churn with our listeners, and some of that may also be related to things like not fulfilling their premiums. If you lose 30% of your members every year and you bring in a new 30%, that's not indicative of a stable organization that's just, maintaining a good relationship with its supporters. Clearly we should be focusing on the digital technology. There's all sorts of things that other radio stations are focused on when they're focused on radio that we're not doing as an organization, because we're not even focused on transmitters that don't work. We've got major infrastructural equipment problems in the network, and the board isn't even focused on that, much less anything more innovative.
Well, is there a technology committee in the Pacifica board?
Oh, that's come and gone. But it really has come and gone. I served on the tech committee at one point. It isn't about committees existing to talk about what we might do better. It's about the board as a whole. When problems are brought to their attention, focusing on those issues that are of importance to the network, and that's not what happens. The board focuses on either factional fights with each other, or in this case, political agendas to take people out. This board, when it was seated, its agenda coming in was to terminate me. They were brand new. That's what they tried to do on day one. First day activity of the new board is let's terminate the ED. And they didn't succeed that weekend, so they came back 4 weeks later to do it. So.
And what is their plan, do you think?
I don't think they have one. I've been told that Margy, when she was asked, so what if her contract is held to be valid, then what do you do? And she said, oh, well, we'll just pay it. And it's okay. In the same conversation, she expressed concern that we weren't paying two attorneys who've been owed money for one of them well over a year now. So what are you going to pay that with? Do you know what I mean? And then expressed concern about the survival of the network. Well, you don't incur hundreds of thousands of dollars of liability through reckless disregard of your employer's advice, and then say it's no big deal, we'll just pay it, when you can't pay any of your bills right now. And of course this has created a whole scenario with our creditors are calling because everyone's agitated because we look like we're in a lot of trouble right now.
And there is the issue of attorneys at KPFA and Pacifica, and there's previous board member Dan Siegel, who was on the executive committee. Apparently an attorney from his firm, Hunter Pyle, has been apparently going to sue you. What is it with the relationship of attorneys at KPFA and Pacifica?
well, one could call it incestuous, but Dan Siegel, who was formerly on our board, is now running for mayor of Oakland, so he can't be on our board anymore. So he was replaced on our board by his employee, Jose Luis Fuentes, who is the person who put forward both motions to fire me. Jose Luis has been at the front charging, doing all of this. And I never met the man before. He certainly wasn't around me long enough to have any opinion on my work. He came in trying to fire me. So
How long has he been on the board?
6 weeks. Or maybe by now we're at 2 months. Where are we at? End of March? Yeah, almost 2 months.
So
It was
he
like
was-
6 weeks when he did this.
So
Yeah.
he was on the board for 6 weeks, and then he puts a motion forward to fire
Well,
you.
no, he was on the board one day when he put forward the first motion to fire me. He was seated, and the next meeting that we had, that was the first thing he did the first day. That was his agenda coming in, was to fire me.
So it sounds like he had been organized ahead of time, not to find out what was going on, but to carry out
he
a
would seem,
program.
yes, he would seem to have come in with a preset agenda. And Hunter Pyle, the attorney, allegedly hired. The interesting thing is the board hasn't. Our lawyer resigned last week. Our general counsel resigned because he wasn't willing to do what the board majority was doing in this situation. Because all of our lawyers have told him not to breach my contract. So how many lawyers have to tell you this is a valid contract and you can't breach it, and you do it anyway? So he resigned on Thursday, and the alleged chair, Margy Wilkinson, simply proclaimed that she had retained counsel, except it doesn't work that way. You have to take a vote on the board. The board hasn't voted to take any legal action here. The board hasn't voted to retain a new lawyer, so I'm not sure on what legal authority she or, any alleged other officers would presume to hire an attorney to do anything, because they haven't gotten board permission to hire this lawyer, much less have him do something.
So how is she taking this action?
I don't know, maybe illegally, like all the rest of the actions. They don't seem to have any regard for the law. I mean, that's what's been absolutely obvious here, is like, laws? What laws? I mean, she actually said it isn't illegal until someone says it is.
And I noticed that they've installed some cameras on the front door.
Well,
What's
we had a couple
happening?
of cameras there already. They've installed an infrared camera from the balcony of the news department to watch our front door and, I guess, see who comes and goes and when we do that. So there's like 24-hour surveillance going on from KPFA at the front door here.
So you're here, there are other supporters of you. What is your plan?
Well, former board members filed an attorney general's complaint. I'm talking to the CPB inspector general. Current board members are filing a lawsuit. And I think, right now the goal is to get some financial transparency on the books, and then to deal with the rogue board members who have grossly jeopardized the foundation's assets. Because if I hadn't chosen to come back to work and I had gone to sue, I'd have a lawyer suing right now. That's a given. Every lawyer has said that. And the organization would be defending against a, several $100,000 lawsuit, which we can't afford. So, I mean, it's literally the reckless endangerment that these board members have put the organization to. And if it's to cover up financial wrongdoing, then getting to the bottom of that. And then eventually, I think, dealing with the structure of the organization so it can't be hijacked like this. I mean, the amount of instability caused by a turnover in the board where a 2-vote difference, causes people to say, we disregard contracts, we don't care what happens to the organization. No, we don't have a transition plan. We haven't got, they almost jammed up payroll last week. Jose Luis called our bank. He's not an officer. I have no idea why he would be calling our banks and trying to close our bank accounts last week. Payroll was being processed. If they'd succeeded in closing...
And who is Jose Luis?
Fuentes, the same attorney that works for Dan Siegel. So this guy isn't an officer, but he's contacting our bank and trying to close our bank accounts and alleging fraud in order to try and do it. And thank God the bank was smarter.
Is that legal for him to do?
Of course not. And if he'd succeeded, we would have had labor code violations all around the country because we wouldn't have made
But as a
payroll.
lawyer, does he have a right to do that?
As a lawyer, I am stunned at everything he is doing. If other lawyers tell you not to do something as an attorney, you would think you would listen, But no, he's been...
So if a charge has been filed against him with the California Bar for violating...
well, that was for his first round of transgressions. New ones haven't been filed for this round. A complaint was filed, I believe, over his conduct at the Washington, D.C. board meeting because he was so threatening to an employment lawyer there that she left the meeting and refused to give further advice to the organization.
What did he do?
He threatened to sue her for malpractice because she told the board to listen to their general counsel's advice. And he did it, according to everyone, in a threatening and abusive manner that caused her to get up from the room and say, I'm leaving, I don't need to put up with this.
So we say that was bullying and intimidation?
That's how it was interpreted by all of the board members that were sitting there who witnessed it, and the attorney, when I spoke with her, seemed extremely upset when she came out of the boardroom. And he was rather abusive to our other female attorney that weekend as well. So, in terms of his conduct towards, other lawyers.
Now, what has been the response of the staff, paid and unpaid, to what is happening here at next to KPFA?
Well, I feel I've had a lot of support from all around the country, from staff and programmers and the general public. I mean, and certainly staff has been somewhat, they're somewhat caught in the middle of this with, Margy giving them a lot of orders. We've tried to just tell them to maintain the status quo. Do what you normally do, you know what I mean? I'm not asking them to do anything they wouldn't normally do in their day-to-day work. And it was very difficult the first week because Margy and her supporters kept trying to sort of, rush the door, and it made it very hard for staff to get in and out to go to work. And it's been a little calmer this last week.
Did they try to come in and put you out or put people out?
They tried that on the first day.
Who was involved in
Margy and Brian Edwards Teeker and a few supporters for Sasha Futron, a couple of other people. Margy's husband.
So they came here and they said, you're not supposed to be here.
She did try that, and
what did she say? What were the words when she came here to?
That I didn't work here anymore. I'd been terminated and I needed to leave. They stayed here all day that first day, and then at the end of the night, very interestingly, she said she was the only person that had any authority to have people in or out of the building, and everyone had to leave. And when no one left, she said, "Okay, well, don't mess anything up. I'm going home now." And I said, "Well, all right, since I actually am in charge, don't worry, everything will be fine. You can go home now." And I thought, really, in a multi-million-dollar corporation, if there are 24 people in your office at 9 o'clock at night, you don't normally say, "I'm in charge." Okay, but since you won't leave, don't mess the place up, I'm leaving. I thought, nobody actually does that in a real business. If you think you're in charge, you close the business for the day, So that was really phenomenal. And they tried a few more times that week and then have finally stopped that gambit. But there's been a lot of pressure put on the staff on a kind of consistent basis about a whole bunch of things. They don't want to acknowledge the fact that they conducted an illegal meeting, that it wasn't noticed, that you don't get to ambush the rest of the board with an unnoticed item as important as breaching a contract worth $315,000 plus benefits. That's not okay, and it's not legal. There are notice requirements for a reason, because you're supposed to know when something really important is going to be on the agenda so that you don't miss that meeting, which is what a couple of people did, because it just wasn't on there, and there was no reason for anyone to think it was going to be. I had flown on a red-eye flight the night before to go to Washington, D.C. to meet with our collective bargaining unit and SAG after. That's what I was doing the day this happened, making the severance obligations to the union in New York, meeting with the union in D.C., getting copyright information from our FCC counsel, and apparently getting fired that night. So that's the rapid succession. I found out in a hotel room on the phone because I wasn't anticipating this happening, So the staff has been hanging in there and doing their jobs and, maintaining through adverse circumstances,
Now, there's an unpaid staff and the paid staff. Brian Edward Teeger is a paid staff member. He's
Yes.
also on the local station board and also on the Pacifica board. Do you find that somewhat of
a legal conundrum? Yes, that my boss is an employee of someone I would supervise, that somebody who's below me in the employment chain is above me in the employment chain. Yes, it's a very odd circumstance because he's in a position to take a vote to fire me, and I'm in a position to have supervisory authority over the person who can fire him. So as a board structure, it is a bit interesting, to say the least.
And, the structure of Pacifica allows for the staff, paid and unpaid, to be on the boards.
Yes.
And do you find that structure should be changed as far as how Pacifica operates?
Well, okay, I find that staff members, whether paid or unpaid, often bring insight to the board about what the operations are of the stations, and they have frequently the most knowledge about what's going on a day-to-day basis in the stations, so they can inform decisions on the board, and that can be very helpful. On the flip side, they obviously will have self-interest, so if you're paid, being paid is one of your self-interests. If you have a show, perhaps having a show is a self-interest. So it can create very problematic dynamics, because if you're in, say, for instance, a very financially distressed organization, and you might have to make decisions, say, to do layoffs at a unit, if someone's a paid staff member at that unit and their job may be affected, well, then they're probably less likely to want to vote for budget cuts that may affect them personally. So it creates conflicts of interest that are almost inevitable.
And there's a contract now between the CWA, mm-hmm. which actually I'm a member of, and KPFA. Mm-hmm. That contract provides for certain procedures and rules. Have there been violations of that contract?
Well, I'm not a union member because I'm management, and we're also not unionized at the national office, but I wouldn't be in a union anyway. I don't know, you mean in terms of his participation on the board?
and what's going on.
Well, I mean, okay, so if the board majority were not being completely hypocritical, this organization is run by progressive discipline. I'm the only person they don't want to apply that to. Okay, my contract requires progressive discipline like all of our other employees, because that's what's in our employee handbook. That's what governs everyone who works for us. And I'm literally the only person that they want to say, no, you've worked here almost 2 years, but actually no evaluation. We're going to pretend you just got here last week, you know. So I don't think that the CPWA contract necessarily has any bearing on this particular situation, and I'm not aware that anyone's violating their relationship with the union by being on our board.
Well, they have argued, the union chapter here, unit, has argued that Pacifica and management is anti-labor.
Oh, but that won't hold up with me. I renegotiated all the union contracts last year. I doubled maternity leave at KPFA and KPFK. I gave people their incremental raises that they hadn't gotten in years. I set up flexible spending accounts for the employees here so that they could save pre-tax money for medical and child care expenses. There is nothing that any of our union staff have asked for that I haven't negotiated to try and see to it that they have that. So that argument won't hold up at all, because I've done more in these union contracts than any of my predecessors in Los Angeles. I put board ops in the union who have never been in the union, people who are kept below the half-time hours in our shop there so that they wouldn't qualify for health care benefits. And that was a management decision. And I overcame that and made the union write 5 positions for board ops into the contract so that they have to get half-time and health care benefits. And most of those people are people of color. So those arguments, if you look at the record, simply don't hold up in relation to me. My grandfather was an official with Longshoremen's Local 10 here for his entire career, so I'm the most pro-union management I think the organization is ever likely to have, and the unions know that. I enjoy a good relationship with them, and even in laying people off in New York, in terms of how one lets long-time employees, you know, when you're doing a layoff, they had medical benefits extended the entire time that we were working on the severance obligation. So instead of being cut off like that, people had medical benefits for like 7 months. So I don't think any of that's valid whatsoever, and I don't think it would hold up when anyone looks at it.
Now, do you think the fact that there's a financial crisis, there may have to be layoffs of paid staff, has anything to do with what's going on here?
Conceivably, the interim general manager, and I mean, everybody knows I was making him get analyses of what the production costs were of paid shows and how much they brought in. I mean, that when he was discussing the grid over there, what I had him come back with was bring me data on the paid programming and what the results are of that paid programming. So I think, based on the information requests I was making, one could surmise that we might have been looking at budget cuts that involved layoffs of staff, certainly, and, you know, they would have been well aware of that next door because the business office was involved in putting some of those projections together for the IGM.
Now, there was a programming proposal to change the morning mix, or to make changes at the station, and that was answered by the unpaid staff organization, came up with a statement about the process of making changes as far as programming at KPFA, and that was halted. I don't know if it was by you, but somebody halted it. What kind of changes do you think they would do if they continue to, if they do take control of the station at KPFA?
Oh, well, that's interesting. Hadn't quite tackled the question from that angle. I mean, at this station in particular, there seems to be more of a power imbalance between the paid and unpaid staff than necessarily exists at some of the other stations. The dynamics here are more intense, and there seems to be more control exercised by paid staff over what happens at the station. So, you know, presumably, because, you know, we're in the middle of also needing to select a general manager here for KPFA, and that's something else that the new board majority attempted to take control of. The bylaws say that I pick the general manager out of a pool presented to me by the LSB, which is what we were in the process of doing. And this P&B majority, dominated by people from Save KPFA, completely wrested control of that and said, no, you have to bring your pick back to the P&B. And then they argued over whether they were making me bring my pick back so that they could simply know about it or so they could ratify and approve of it. I think ratify and approve is where they were headed so that they could pick the general manager here. And I do think if you have all of this control resting with just a few people, that, you know, yes, conceivably that could have an effect on what happens programmatically in the next year if they pick their general manager and the control is very centralized amongst a few people and paid staff. Then that might inevitably affect where unpaid programming ends up.
So you're saying that the paid staff has a great deal of control as far as the programming in KPFA?
You have a great deal of paid staff here compared to other stations, for one thing, but there seems to be unanimous agreement that they exercise a certain degree of control here that they don't at other stations.
Now, I mean, one of the issues at Pacifica at the different stations is interim managers, interim program directors. I mean, it seems like everyone is interim, and they're here today, they're gone tomorrow, then they come back. What is going on with the process of having regular management that are responsible and accountable and don't disappear and come back, as has been happening in many, many stations?
I think we're back to the structure. It's a dysfunctional board structure leading to a great deal of instability within the organization and a tremendous amount of management churn. Nobody seems to last very long in leadership positions. The joke is that you'll last longer as an interim than you will once they make you permanent, which apparently looks like they were correct, I think, these are completely political decisions, maybe to cover up financial, issues. But if you have a structure that is highly politicized so that people are constantly toppling people, a board takes power, and so it's like, the purges begin. Let us fire the people that aren't going to do our bidding. And nobody's looking, you want me to stop? Nobody's looking at business stuff. People are only looking at, political agendas. So it isn't like they're making decisions on managers based on you're doing a good job or you're not doing a good job. They just come in and say, are you doing what we want you to do? So I think that contributes greatly. And it's a hostile environment for management, to be perfectly honest,
So what do you have to say to So what do you have to say to the listeners and supporters of KPFA and Pacifica about what's going on here?
Well, I think, all of us agree the network is very important. The mission is important. I wouldn't be involved if I didn't care about Pacifica and think alternative media was tremendously important to all social justice, issues. I think that people need to kind of stick with Pacifica regardless of what's going on and support, finding out the truth. It's a listener-supported organization. You should want to know what happened with your money. So I think that we need support through what inevitably is going to be a cleanup operation here of figuring out what has been going on for several years. And hopefully when it's done, we'll have an organization that's been shed of some of the problems that it has and has a more transparent, relationship with the public and is back to supporting its mission. I think, the mission is fantastic. The listeners are fantastic, and most of the people that are involved are fantastic. Most of the people involved in Pacifica really care about the organization and whatever it is they're on the air talking about. So I think it's just one of those situations where people have to patiently stick with with something they love while it's going through a very difficult period of dealing with some internal organizational problems and perhaps some really serious financial problems. And I would hope that we get on the other side of that and we have 5 stations that are still connected in a network and we're still providing programming to 180 affiliates. I think and we may want to revision who we are, as a community radio network. I think this has opened up for that bigger discussion as to where do we put our resources? Do we have resources heavily invested in paid on-air staff, or do we put more of those resources into production support for volunteer community programming? I think this situation that is revolving around me and the books and all this has opened up the much broader discussion of what is the structural integrity of the organization. Are the bylaws working? Do these boards function in any way that serves the organization? Are they completely self-serving? And then who are we? Because financially we're still on the edge, so I think need to revision what we're doing with our resources and how we're focusing them. And I think we may come out on the other side of that completely reinvigorated, because a lot of people have expressed a sense of relief, even though this is very tumultuous right now, but that such bad things have been going on for so long that maybe now's the opportunity to clean them up, because they've so overstepped their bounds. They've acted with such illegality that now it's like, the abuse of power is so obvious, we can deal with it. And I think that's hopeful. I mean, I've gotten so much encouraging support of people who are like, please, thank you, deal with this, So from that perspective, I'm like, fantastic, let's deal with it,
Of course. Oh, it was a great.
Get people are going to church now. To speak out there.
Yeah, it's pretty hot.
What's the impression?
Yeah. Okay.